what I'd like to do is to move on a bit and talk about the Ewing versus Goldstein case, okay? And I'm going to talk about that as a way of orienting us and thinking about, what kinds of things can one do, whether the issues are foreseeable or not, to have a better chance of acting ethically, being consistent, and having integrity in what we do. And you notice I'm making the presumption that that's the intent that most of us have to begin with. And I realize that there are some, albeit I believe fairly rare, but there are some mental health professionals who are have difficulties in the area of conscience, okay? But that's pretty unusual. It happens, but it's pretty unusual, okay? And so I'm making that assumption, and I think it's a fair one in this circumstance. Now, as I talk about this case, I don't want to imply to you that I think that the clinician here did anything wrong. I actually think he was encountering a thunderbolt from Zeus, okay? But I'm using this case purposefully because I think it's a great example of where we think we know something, and if he had come to me, I probably would have told him what he already thought. But where even when we think we know something, how important it is to follow a series of steps to reduce the likelihood of harm to clients and harm to us, okay? So again, this is not a personal indictment of Dr. Goldstein at all. In fact, I, have no other reason to think that he's anything but a reasonable, good guy and a good clinician, all right? Well, what happened was he started seeing in, I guess, the mid to late 90s, a guy by the name of Gino Calillo. Gino was a police officer in the Los Angeles Police Department one time. And he was a man with some significant difficulties. He was depressed, he was upset, anxious, suicidal when he came into therapy. He was someone who had been in a relationship for quite a long time. He was 32 years old. He'd met her and fallen in love with her when he was 15. So they'd been seeing each other for 17 years. It was his first love, okay? At least from the sound of it, from the record that I've read. And the impression I have from the material that was published is that the therapy actually went pretty well. He had a number of complaints about his workplace, dealing with
his previous girlfriend.
And it seems like he actually stabilized. His suicidal ideation reduced significantly. Depression was remitting to some extent. And so therapy was good. And it was a therapy of about 4 years, 4.5 years. But in the spring of 2001, his longtime love broke up with him. She left him. And he was devastated. And he began not only to have suicidal ideation, he began to be very obsessive, and as the spring progressed, apparently showed more and more kind of obsessive interest in his ex-girlfriend's new love, his ex-girlfriend's boyfriend, Keith Ewing. And while he didn't mention the name, he apparently knew who he was. He continued to ask Dr. Goldstein questions like, how could she love him? How could she fall in love with him? So he was very stuck on that particular issue. At one point in June of 2001, Gino came in, I think it was the 3rd week on a Wednesday, and Dr. Goldstein got concerned about his increased suicidality, and also he got the sense, I don't know if it was something directly said or indirectly said, by the intensity of Gino's obsessions regarding this ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend, that Gino might be stalking him or intending some harm to him. So he said, "Are you stalking him?" And Gino denied it flatly. And I think Dr. Goldstein believed his denial. It seemed credible to him. But he was concerned, that is, Goldstein was concerned about Gino's potential for suicide. And because he knew that Gino was close to his parents and very involved with his family, he said, "Is it okay with you if I call your mom and dad in the event that I think you need some extra support and we need to bring them in to help us?" And Gino was amenable to that. He was close to his parents and that was fine with him. I believe that he signed a release in order for that to happen, but he certainly had verbal okay. Well, a couple of days later, Dr. Goldstein got a call on a Friday evening, probably around 5 or 6, when all good phone calls having to do with child abuse and Tarasov, commitments, they all happened right around that time. He got a call, very distressing call from Gino's father. Mr. Colillo called and said, Gino came over for dinner and I've never seen him so suicidal. He said to me, give me your weapon. And when I asked him why, he said, because if you don't, I'm going to go home and get mine, and I'm going to go and shoot Keith Ewing, and this boyfriend, and then I'm going to kill myself. And Dad responded, you got to buckle down, son. Okay. Now, those of you who've done dangerousness evaluations know that when there's an escalating cycle, that is, when we have a no violence to some violence, that's very significant. There can also be de-escalating cycles, or cycles where there's been no violence at all. But in this case, we saw an escalating cycle. Dad was very concerned. And what Dr. Goldstein said to Mr. Colillo was, get Gino to the hospital. Just go. Which they did. And apparently Gino was willing to go to the hospital, willing to be voluntarily hospitalized. And they went to Northridge. It's in Southern California. And they got there, and there is some dispute about what actually took place in the intake. Mr. Capilla, who was the intake social worker, did what looked like was a standard intake. And Gino pled with him, please do not 5150 me. I would take away his gun. Okay? And it takes a long time to get it back. In any event, so he agreed, Mr. Capilla agreed, I won't 5150 you. In filling out the form, and many of you who do hospital work have seen, there's a form that says, HO, or HI, homicidal ideation, SI, suicidal ideation, and you draw a 0 with a line through it if it's none there. The area for homicidal ideation was left blank. And the dispute was that Mr. Capilla said they never said anything about the threats to this ex-boyfriend. The family said not only they told him that, but they told the intake worker about about Gino striking his father. Well, that turned out to be pretty crucial because of subsequent events. Still, Gino did go into the hospital, and he stayed overnight Friday night, and then on Saturday afternoon, Dr. Goldstein got another phone call, and he got a phone call, this time from Mr. Colillo, again distressed, saying the psychiatrist is saying he's going to release Gino this afternoon.
You can imagine Dr. Goldstein asking why, and the psychiatrist saying,
there's no basis for holding him because he's not a danger to self or others, and he's denying any of that ideation, and he's rational and doesn't seem to fit any diagnostic category, and he can't keep him. Could you please talk to the psychiatrist? Well, apparently, and this is from what I've gathered from the appellate court cases, so I'm not sure what actually happened underlying this, but apparently there was some divine intervention because Dr. Goldstein actually got to talk live to the psychiatrist. And so the psychiatrist was in some ways between a rock and a hard place. He was hearing from the psychologist, or in this case an MFT, and also from the parent that this guy was dangerous.
You can imagine that he was probably seeing someone before him
Who was presenting very well. When you work with police officers who know the system, they know what to say. They can look quite credible.
He was probably oriented in all spheres. He was probably rational. He was probably quite convincing. And
the next day, Gino drove to the ex-boyfriend's parents' house, where the ex-boyfriend, or excuse me, the ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend, Keith's parents' house, where he was living. Keith was out in front of the house washing his car, and Gino got out of his car and took his service revolver and shot Keith Ewing in the head, killing him, and then killed himself. Not surprisingly, of course, both families were really devastated. and the Ewing family sued. What was somewhat surprising in their lawsuit was that they said that Dr. Goldstein, in the suit against Dr. Goldstein, had a duty to warn them, and in particular Keith Ewing, because Gino had informed them, or rather it had informed Dr. Goldstein, that he was a danger to Keith Ewing. Dr. Goldstein's attorneys defended in a way that I think was appropriate, and they said, wait a minute. Most of us had learned for years that that idea of what if a best friend calls us up and says that our client is threatening to hurt a third party, did we have a duty to warn? And all of us had learned no. Why? Because 43.92 of the Civil Code, which is the Tarasoff provision, says when a patient communicates to a psychotherapist, it doesn't say when a patient's friend, parent, when, the patient's third cousin 3 times removed, it says when the patient communicates. Yeah. But the family alleged that because he learned this from the father, a reliable family member, that he had a duty to warn. The defense attorneys for Goldstein said, no. The statute's plain. The statute says when a patient communicates to a psychotherapist. And the trial court, having been proficient, and I imagine even went to law school, read the statute and said, that's what it says, and threw the case out. I'm sure the trial court wasn't happy about that, but said, the way the law is crafted, there is no basis for a lawsuit here on a summary judgment. Understandably, the family appealed it. Okay? And when they went to the Southern California Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals did something very strange. They said, well, patient communication to a psychotherapist includes when a family member provides that information in furtherance of the treatment. So a little over 2 years ago, it's 2.5 years now, the Ewing versus Goldstein court rewrote the statute. Dr. Goldstein's attorneys and quite a number of mental health professions and professionals were pretty disturbed by that ruling, so they appealed it to the Supreme Court of California, the same court that some 30 years before gave us, almost exactly 30 years before actually, gave us Tarasoff in all of its ambiguous glory. Right? And they said, we don't want to hear this case, we're going to let it stand. There were some statutory changes that were proposed by Kampft. They were very good and very simple. They said, well, we don't want to have this particular case being precedent for future cases, so we are asking the legislature to change the law to say when the patient, him or herself, communicates to the psychotherapist. I will tell you about the fate of that particular legislation a little bit later today. But what happened to Dr. Goldstein was that he was held liable, and it was went back to the court to determine whether, actually probably should step back from saying he was held liable. He was potentially liable for failing to warn in this case, and it had to go back to the trial court. So he had to, at one level, accept responsibility for something that essentially was not what the law said at the time that he made the decision. Okay? And something that was a commonly accepted standard, that we wouldn't warn in that circumstance. So this kind of seemingly impossible conundrum, what I want to do is I want to rewind the verbal clock here for a moment and say, okay, let's assume that we could go back to the point on that Friday night and that Saturday, and we could be the consulting group for Dr. Goldstein. He calls and he says, do you have any suggestions? I've told the family they should go to the hospital and take him to the hospital. Do you have any thoughts about anything else I might consider? I am concerned about him harming this other guy. What might you suggest to him at that point? You might want to talk to Gino about giving the weapons to his dad and putting it in a gun cabinet. Put Gino on the phone. Let me talk. Gino, When we talked last time, you denied you were going to hurt. Your father just told me that you hit him in the mouth. Did you hit him in the mouth? Did you threaten Keith Ewing? Interestingly enough, if Gino says to you, yes, we have a Tarasoff, we do it, done. If Gino says no, we then make a clinical decision. Is it reliable information that he's giving us or not? We could still do a warning even if Gino said no, given the information the dad had, because we can use our clinical judgment at that point, because we've talked to the client and we're saying, okay, I don't think he's telling me the truth. I think he's lying to me. And I think there's a serious risk. The communication here may be subtle, but it's there. But we've talked to the client. You know, particularly if he had a good relationship with Dr. Goldstein might call him at the hospital and say, Gino, last night, do you remember where you were? Now, I may not be able to keep you there, but you need to stay. And here are the reasons. So if the relationship, which is responsible for most of the positive outcome in therapy anyway, works, great. If not, okay, but it was another thing that he could do.